السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله على آله وصحبه ومن والاه. The lecture today is about Islamic ethics as a field or as a discipline. Ethics within the Islamic tradition, how did it work? What kind of other disciplines contributed to this one? As a disclaimer, for the information mentioned here, they are based on two things. First of all, my readings and my experience in teaching a course on Islamic ethics now 3 or 4 years. So I learned a lot from my students also. When I gave these lectures, I told you it's a foundational course in our college. So I have all the students from the college. They are very intelligent students and critical ones. So every day, every year, I improve my understandings. The second also, I have been in intensive discussions, debates, deliberations, and sometimes big disagreements also and agreements with my colleague Dr. Mu'taz al-Khatib. Unfortunately, he couldn't be with us today. He is the professor of the Methodology of Ethics in CILE. So I learned a lot also from these discussions, which will be reflected in the lecture today. So I acknowledge also his contribution to this lecture, and I'm very grateful for his insights. So I will try to give more or less an anatomy of the field in the Islamic tradition and how it worked. We start with the terminology. The root kha, lam, qaf. When we look into it and its derivatives, like akhlaq, the most common Arabic word for ethics, and its plurals, other derivatives, it more or less speaks about how someone or something has been originally shaped and brought into being. So it's about shaping, making. As a technical term, when it moved from the lexicons and the dictionaries into scholarship, the work of scholars, it spoke about shaping someone, but by focusing the link between one's body, khalq, one's creation, sometimes termed as the outer, al-zahir, the external, and one's psyche or character, khuluq, sometimes called the inner or the internal. So shaping here has two aspects. One of them is inner, inside, which sometimes called the psyche, al-nafs, or the soul, al-ruh, or al-batin, just the inner. And another part which is the visible, the external one. All the disciplines that we will speak about later focused on these two main aspects, al-zahir and al-batin. How these two aspects relate to each other when it comes to ethics, how would one's inner structure affect the outer, or vice versa? Which aspect should have the upper hand in determining one's morality? What makes someone morally committed person, the inner or the outer? What is more important? How these two aspects can get fixed, repaired, improved, get better, get worse, etc. This is the work that has been done around khuluq or akhlaq as a technical term. All the disciplines are working on this, the relationship between the inner and the outer. What kind of relation do they have? How do they contribute to one's morality? How they can get fixed? How they can get repaired, improved, etc. In our talk today, we will approach ethics as an interdisciplinary field where 5 other disciplines have been contributing to it throughout the history of the Islamic tradition. We have philosophy, theology, Sufism, fiqh and usul, and adab. So we will outline how each of these 5 contributed to ethics or the ethical tradition in Islam or in Islamic history in the light of what I just explained, the inner, the outer, the psyche or the soul and the body, etc., or the behavior. We will start with philosophy where ethics is usually almost uniformly explained as the following. State of the psyche, some speak about deeply sated, هيئة في النفس راسخة, sometimes هيئة في النفس, just state of the psyche. Deeply sated state of the psyche which dictates it to perform certain actions without reflection or perspicacity. So هيئة للنفس راسخة تدعوها إلى فعل من غير فكر ولا روية. So you do acts as part of your habit, naturally, emanating from your psyche because of its state. You improved the state of the psyche so that the actions will emanate naturally. So you are not acting, you are not imposing things on yourself. This is how they understood ethics, akhlaq. Their focus was, of course, the psyche, the inner, inside, al-batin, how it can be examined, how it can be understood, repaired, fixed, how does it produce moral or immoral actions, how does the psyche work. Muslim philosophers, like most of their work, not only on ethics, they have been heavily influenced by the Greek tradition and the Greek works translated into Arabic. As part of this Greek tradition, there is a very important part usually called Platonic trichotomy, تقسيم الثلاثي الأفلاطوني. This Platonic trichotomy of the soul tries to explain what is our psyche, what is the nature of our psyche, in order to understand how ethics work, innerly speaking. Says that the soul or the psyche in nafs consists of three main powers. قوة or ملكات, powers or faculties. The rational power, القوة العقلية. The concupiscent power, القوة الشهوانية. The irascible power, القوة الغضبية. So there is a power which is dominated by reason or by intellect. There is a power which is dominated by anger, like defending yourself, fighting in the battle, etc. There is a power dominated by our lusts, our desires. In order to exist, we need the three. So without the desires for lusts, etc., we will never reproduce ourselves, we will not eat, we will not survive. So we need these desires. Without the desires related to anger, etc., to defend ourselves, to defend our communities, our people, our societies, etc. And the rational power, of course, for learning, for wisdom, etc. In order to, the main work of ethics is that we understand how these three powers work and try to keep balance between the three by giving the leadership to the rational power. Leadership, so not suppressing all the other two, but putting the other two in balance through giving the leadership to the rational power. Once you do this, the three will become in balance. You will have what they call the doctrine of the mean, madhab al-wasat, and then you will achieve justice, adl, between the three powers, and the person will produce moral acts. When there is imbalance in any of these three powers, one is getting too much concern and attention than the others, then there will be imbalance and the person will not behaving normally. Like when not everything in balance in the body, you will have bodily problems and not functioning properly. This is the same with the nafs. You should have these three. This is, of course, a Greek tradition and Greek theory. This theory was incorporated and adopted by Muslim philosophers, sometimes with some minor adaptations, sometimes without adaptations at all. There have been some critique coming from other disciplines, from other specialists in Islamic tradition, saying that, for instance, this is much more Greek than Islamic. This is actually not really Islamic ethics. And whenever they, the philosophers, or those who advocate this theory of philosophical ethics, when they quote the Quran and the Sunnah in order to justify these three, they find that it is too much exaggeration, over interpretation for the verses. Like, for instance, the verse in Surah Nahl, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ وَإِيتَاءِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى. Many scholars try to take this verse to show that this shows that the three powers existing in the nafs, etc. There are, like Ar-Raghib al-Asfahani, for instance, he did this in his work. So that the scriptures here have been instrumentalized. You use them just an instrument to justify perceptions that you have got from somewhere else. So you are not approaching the Quran and Sunnah to build up your knowledge, but to justify the already existing knowledge. And these are two different approaches. There have been also other critique, like, for instance, it is too abstract. It doesn't have a practical tool to see how these things will happen in life. Too much a focus on the doctrine of the mean, madhab al-wasat, although al-wasat is not always a good thing. Sometimes for some values, like, for instance, justice. Justice has no mean, has no wasat. Justice is never exaggerated. There is no too much justice. Whatever justice you do is always great and amazing. So this is some of the critique that have been given to the contribution of philosophy to the field of ethics, or to the interdisciplinary discipline of ethics. This is when it comes to philosophy. Theology, the focus of Muslim theologians was not on the psyche, was not on the inner, the self. Their focus was on the act, al-fi'l. Whether the agent of this act is God, af'alullah, or the act is made by humans, af'alul ibad. They focused on two main things. I think Brother Chauki explained this in the previous lecture: ontology and epistemology. Two main questions about the act. Ontology is the nature of being, literally. So it's not about the action is good or bad. No. We try to understand the very nature of the act. How does it come into existence? What is it exactly? I give you an example when it comes to ontological question to ethics. When we say that Facebook, Twitter, social media, using them, Facebook is good or bad? It depends, for instance, on our use, how we use it. This already automatically means ontological perception of the Facebook, that it doesn't have inherent quality by itself. So Facebook by itself, by giving this answer, it is not good, it is not bad, it depends on how we use. So it has neutral value, it has zero value. You can use it for doing good things, you can use it for bad things. This very simple example presupposes that we think that an entity like Facebook is neutral value, which means that what determines its goodness or badness is the subject, myself. When I use it for hurting people, it becomes bad. When I use it for giving benefit to people, it becomes good. So I am the one who creates the goodness and the badness of Facebook or Twitter, which means that it has neutral value. It has neutral value. This is what we say subjectivism. And some theologians thought like this. Not only for Facebook, and of course they didn't have Facebook and Twitter at this time, but they speak about acts in general, al-fi'l in general. Doesn't have an inherent value, it depends on what we give it to it. To go to some extreme examples, for instance, lying. Is lying good or bad? In principle, bad. Is it inherently bad, or is it bad because we agreed that it is bad?
We agree.
And we can agree that it can be good. For subjectivism, the approach of subjectivism, it would say that it's coming from outside. If we say outside here is God, this is the divine common theory, this is the Ash'ari school. So lying became bad because God prohibited it. But if God commanded it, we would think that it is something good. Yeah? So we started with the example of the Facebook and Twitter just to let you how far we can go. So the one approach says that acts by themselves, in themselves, they don't have a value of being good or bad. It depends what the subject is determining, what the subject is doing, or how the subject is using them. But if we say that it has, like for instance, lying is something bad in principle, all the time, under all circumstances, in principle it's good, it's bad, it can be good only by exception. It means there is an inherent quality in the act. There is badness inside. Telling the truth has goodness inside it. It doesn't matter who the subject is. So God commanded it, God prohibited it, etc. There is something inside it. So this was an ontological question that took too much energy from the theologians trying to explain this. The acts have inherent quality, so it is the approach of objectivism. The object is the important. Or it is about the subject. This is this approach of subjectivism. So there is a value neutral characteristic of the acts. Is this clear so far? Yeah? Okay. The other question is the epistemology. Whether we agree that acts have inherent quality or value neutral, they don't have inherent quality. The following question is that how do we know this? Like Facebook, we say is not good, is not bad. We used subjectivism approach. How did we do that? This is an epistemological question. What made us come to this judgment? How do we know what we know? Which sources of knowledge do we consult in order to come to our conclusions? Usually, we have two main big opposing approaches. One saying that we know this through human intellect. Our mind, as humans, the main thing that God gifted us with, this is the human intellect. And this is the approach of rationalism. So we can use our human intellect, our logic, our common sense, in order to judge specific acts as good or bad. This is rationalism, and the main school that supported this was Mu'tazila. The other one is revelation or tradition, the approach of traditionalism. It is God. If we adopted the divine common theory in ontology, then we have to use revelation in the epistemology. How do we know that lying is bad? Because God prohibited it in the Quran and condemned people who lie. Some, like Maturidi, some Mu'tazila, because by the way, in order to give a label to a specific school is very difficult and problematic because the issues are so controversial. So you will always find some people in some schools who do not agree with the mainstream in the school and would give another opinion. So don't worry about the Mu'tazila and Ash'ira, etc. Just the approaches that we have. Who spoke about partial rationalism, partial traditionalism. So some acts we can know their goodness or badness, whether inherent or value neutral coming from the subject through intellect, others we cannot. Even the Mu'tazila themselves, the main advocates of rationalism, they adopted this. They said that there are some acts, like for instance praying 5 times a day. Is this good or bad? It is good. How did we know that? It's the revelation, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us or to fast 1 month in the year, or to pray in that way at this time. All these details, the main source of knowledge which helped us to come to this conclusion is not the human intellect, but it is the tradition. Also, one of the questions that theologians worked on in ethics and morality is that when we judge an act as good or bad, do we adopt the same criteria in both human and divine actions or not? Yeah? This was a big debate also. The Mu'tazila, they used the approach قياس الغائب على الشاهد or الشاهد على الغائب. The others didn't accept this, etc. So anyhow, some theologians thought that we must have one criteria for both. So what we see as bad by humans cannot be done by God. Others said no. You cannot use the same criteria, otherwise it will be difficult. And of course, sometimes they go to extremes. Usually, the problem is always the problem of the extremes. Let's take an example here of these extremes. Someone would say, if we have someone who have 100 slaves, for instance, and these slaves are engaging in illegal sexual relationships in front of his eyes. He can prevent them from doing that, and he doesn't. Is this good or bad act? Bad. Okay, this is what's happening with us as humans, and God is seeing us and letting it happen. Is this good or bad? If you use the same criteria, it will be bad. This type of discussions which we see in that. Another also question that have been asked is about the changeability, or how do we say it, the fixed character, the changeable or fixed character of judging human acts. So for instance, when we say lying is bad, does this mean lying has been bad and is bad and will remain bad till the end of life? Or it may change? Also a big debate among the people. We have seen some examples in our life. For instance, there have been some stuff upon which almost all humans agreed upon, or all ethical traditions in general, like for instance having a relationship outside marriage. It has been something bad. Nowadays it's not. What for at least the majority of the Muslims, it must have a marital institution. It must be within the institution of marriage. Then the act will be good. Now in the West, in Europe and the US, generally speaking, what makes the act good is the consent. It's not the institution of marriage, it is the consent. If you don't have consent, even within the institution of marriage, it will be bad. If you have the consent and there is no institution of marriage, it will be good, and it can even be recognized by law. I remember in one of the summer schools which I attended as a student, we're reading some texts from different religions, and there was a text on coming from Christianity, one of the authoritative texts in Christianity, and the author is speaking about fixed and changeable morality, and he said, gave an example of one of the fixed moralities that will never change in life is having a relationship outside marriage, which will always be bad and it will never change. When the students were reading that, our colleagues, they were just laughing when they read that because it has changed. So there are things which change. There are things which did not change. Like till now, we agree that killing innocent people is bad. Or killing children is bad, although we do it, and we have been doing that throughout history. But still, we do it, although we agree that it is bad and it is not good, and we condemn people for doing that. This didn't change. But there are other things that changed. So the question of the good or bad character of the act, is it fixed? Is it changeable according to circumstances, according to time, etc.? Also one of the big questions in theology. But as I said, the focus here was more on, when it comes to morality, was on the act and the nature of the act. Fine, now theology. How did it work, ethics and theology?
Take it to the moral relativism, that is existing now in the Western...
Yes, when moral relativism can be possible, when not, etc. So that the moral or immoral character of the act can change depending on the context. Yeah. Now about Sufism. Sufism, one of the disciplines in which the relationship with ethics is almost straightforward and can hardly be denied. Or it is difficult to say that we cannot find a relationship between both, to the extent that some Sufi masters like Abdullah al-Harawi, the one whose book was explained by Ibn al-Qayyim in Madarij al-Salikin. So al-Harawi wrote Manazil al-Sa'irin and Ibn al-Qayyim wrote Madarij al-Salikin as an explanation for him. Abdullah al-Harawi said, al-tasawwuf huwa al-khuluq. Sufism is ethics. As if exclusively, it's nothing but ethics. In the works on Sufism, usually it is a tradition, a norm in the Sufi scholarship that you have chapters, one of them called khuluq and the other called adab. When you check the content of these two chapters, you will find great overlap. So you would say, what is the difference between khuluq and adab in this Sufi literature? Very difficult to know what's the difference, because some people would mention some values in the chapter on adab, others would put these values in the chapter on khuluq, and vice versa. So although ethics was omnipresent in Sufism, akhlaq was everywhere in Sufism, as Al-Harawi mentioned, and it's true. It's the way they addressed akhlaq. It's never static. It's never uniform. It's never addressed in the same way. And this is something typical of Sufism, because Sufism is based on the experience, tajruba. It's not based on abstract thinking all the time. It's based on al-hal, the personal circumstances of the person. It differs from one to one, etc. So it's very difficult and elusive to find a consistent way of how they addressed morality in their scholarship. But we can speak about general characteristics. One of them is that although they focused on the interior, an-nafs, and disciplining it, تأديب النفس, they also found the exterior character of the or al-zahir is also important. So for them, for instance, an ethically committed Sufi is someone who disciplines and purifies his inner psyche. So this is the batin. He should be pure from inside, but concurrently demonstrates the internal morality into visible actions and good manners, even in clothing, eating, speaking, sleeping, etc. So you will find the Sufi literature, when it comes to ethics, not only speaking about zuhd, being ascetic, or patient, sabr, etc., but will also speak how should you clothe yourself, how should you eat, how should you speak to the people, the manners, the etiquettes of daily life, etc. So this inner purity should be reflected also in the actions and dealing with others, as they say, dinul muamala. The second thing is that centrality of learning by example. You don't learn ethics from books. You learn ethics by following an example, a lively example in front of your eyes. And a very famous statement, قول عمل حال رجل في ألف رجل خير من قول ألف رجل لرجل. So a statement by 1,000 person to one person is much less effective than this actual state and practice and experience of one person affecting 1,000 person. So one living example can affect 1,000, but 1,000 people speaking can hardly affect one. So this learning by example, that's why the relationship between a sheikh and al-murid, the master and the disciple, is very important. You always must have someone to follow. So there must be uswa. So their real Sufi master, the core Sufi master for them is the Prophet ﷺ. You go back to them, and then it goes up to your own direct sheikh or master. Another common characteristic of Sufi ethics is their epistemology. So there has been a great debate, as we have seen today, among theologians about how do we know what we know? How do we know that something is moral or immoral or ethical or unethical? Is it human intellect? Is it revelation? According to the Sufis, there is a third source, which can sometimes be more important and can even, according to some Sufis, in some contexts, can overrule the two, the human intellect and the revelation, which is the nafs itself, the ruh, the self-revealed knowledge. And they use a hadith like istafti qalbak, your heart can be a source of revelation, and you know the right and the bad, the right and the wrong, the good and the bad by yourself. This is something in which they excelled about this. But of course they speak here about the heart, which has been disciplined, which has been purified. Not everyone. So you come to a specific state in which you will get guided by God directly to know the right and the wrong, the good and the bad, without exerting too much efforts. So you don't have to read books of fiqh, you don't have to consult theologians, etc., to know the good and bad. It's something that will emanate from your heart directly after you exert the mujahada, disciplining your soul. So this is also an important contribution from the Sufism. The fiqh and usul, they were their focus, not necessarily their exclusive concern, but their focus was human act at the level of epistemology, but with a strong interest in the practical aspects of human acts. This is one of the disciplines which comes very close to what we now call applied ethics. Ethics in the field, in your daily life, how to act and what to do, what not to do. When it comes to epistemology, they had the centrally of divine will. Your task in life is to put the divine will into act. تحقيق مراد الله. God created us for reasons, for a specific, he wanted something from us. He didn't create us in vacuum or for nothing. There is something that he needed from us. In general, that's worship, ibadah, or we can add imarat al-ard, etc. Anyhow, there are general objectives, but these will be detailed throughout the whole phases of your life. When you are, from the time you are adult up to the moment of death, when you are healthy, when you are sick, when you are a merchant, when you are a teacher, when you are, there is divine will all the time. And the almost agreed upon rule, لله في كل واقعة حكم. In every incident, God has a say to tell you what to do and what not to do. The art of the fiqh was first to discover what the divine will is. In context X or Y or Z, what is the divine will? The second, how to apply it and put it into practice, considering all the surrounding circumstances. Because of this focus or subject or concern, the jurists, the fuqaha, came to the conclusion that the binary division, good and bad, will not work. So we cannot divide acts into hasan and qabih, like the theologians. This will not work. It must be much more nuanced than this. Because when God expresses his will, it's not always in the good and the bad. So they went outside the narrow division of good and bad into the more extended one of al-ahkam al-khams. 5 categories. Human acts will be divided into 5 categories. At the two extremes, you have the obligatory and the prohibited. What you have to do, what you shouldn't do. And then, close to the obligatory, you have the recommended, what you are recommended to do. And close to the prohibited, the reprehensible, what you are recommended not to do. And then you have the neutral. The value neutral act, al-mubah. When we read the works on theology and on fiqh, we see, at least this is my impression, and I discuss this with my students all the time, we have evidence that they didn't come to the 5 categories in an overnight. The debate was so intensive and so heatedly debated discussions. I have seen in المغني في أبواب العدل والتوحيد for عبد الجبار, I think he came with 3 or 4 categories. He tried to go beyond the الحسن والقبيح, but he didn't come up with the 5. And القاضي عبد الجبار is a towering figure when it comes to intelligence, when it comes to thinking, amazing person. But he didn't come up with the 5. The one who came with the 5, if I'm not mistaken, is Abdul Qahir al-Baghdadi. Maybe some people before him, but this is the earliest I could find in my readings. الرسالة of Al-Shafi'i makes reference more or less to these 5 categories, but he doesn't mention them by name, these 5 categories as they are. But anyhow, in a specific moment in history, whatever this moment was, they came to an agreement that we have أحكام خمسة, we don't have Hasan and Qabih only. It will not work like this. One of the important things that has been discussed in fiqh and which has some relevance in our modern time is what is the role of the faqih? Does the role of the faqih is to judge the acts for me? To say that this is halal or haram, etc. Or he is someone who is providing professional help for me? I want to know the divine will. How can I put it into practice in this context? Sometime, maybe most of the time, I know how to do that. It's easy. Like, should I tell the truth or I lie? I know that I should tell the truth unless there is very exceptional situation. I don't have to ask a jurist for this, a faqih for this. But there are some times in which I do not know. So I go to the faqih, not because I don't want to know his own opinion. No. I want him to help me how to know God's opinion. I want to know what God says in this, and I don't know. So I need professional help to let me go into that. That's why I can disagree with the jurist. I can go to another jurist, etc. But anyhow, this is also some of the debates when it comes to the work of the faqih. Also, one of the modern questions is fiqh identical to ethics or not? So, if I follow al-ahkam al-shar'iyya, it means I'm doing everything ethical? Or it's not enough? To make it a bit more controversial, is it possible that the faqih would say something that's halal, but if I do it, it will become unethical, even if it is halal or not? Well, a question that people has been debating around it for maybe since the beginning of the 20th century. We have this, and we have 3 main positions that we can talk about. Some people say, of course, fiqh is ethics and ethics is fiqh, because fiqh is not about law. Fiqh is about how do I please my creator, how do I achieve mardatillah. And this is a very ethical mission. It's nothing but ethics. The others say no, not necessarily. And they come up with some examples in the fiqh by the fuqaha themselves, especially the phrase like athima wa sahha. I can give you some examples. We are here in the California Islamic University, for instance, and we find this classroom a very nice one. So we decided to take it over. We will not buy it, we will not register, we will just take it over. This is an illegal ownership. It's not good. So it's an unethical act. I hope we don't disagree on this. So it's an ethical act. But still, it's time for Zohar. So we thought we have to pray Zuhr. Doesn't mean that we own it illegally, we will disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No. So we have to pray. Okay, and we prayed. This is what they call as-salatu fi ardin maghsuba. So you pray on a land which has been owned in an illegal way. Would this act of praying be accepted or not? They would say athima, the person committed a sin, but praying is acceptable. It's valid because you made all the conditions. You pray on pure land, ardun tahira, your clothes are pure, you made the wudu, you made all the acts. So there is no reason in fiqh speaking to say that salat is valid. But the act was unethical. So here they themselves made a distinction between the ethical and the legal. So they made the act valid, but they said you were wrong. There are many examples. Hajj. So I deceived people and I took their money. And with this money I went to Hajj so that God will expiate my sins. They would say the Hajj is valid. So the obligation to perform Hajj, you have been relieved from this, you did it. But the act is unethical, and so on. They will take these examples. They also mention another argument that some of the fuqaha wrote books on ethics. So they would have their own book on fiqh, and they would write another book but on ethics, akhlaq. The very literalist, Ibn Hazm, who is just, literalist, Zahiri. So it's not just a jurist who is stick to text, he would read the text in a literalist way. So very little space for going beyond the text. Just to give an example, the hadith about marriage and the consent of the woman. The hadith said if the woman didn't marry before, إذا كانت بكرا, her consent, so the woman should always give her consent. If the woman didn't have the experience of marriage before, her consent is that she will keep silent. She is embarrassed. She didn't have experience of marriage before, so when her father says X is coming to marry you, and she keeps silent, means she accepts, because if she is not, she will scream and say, of course not. So if she keeps silent, means she agrees. وَإِذْنُهَا صُمَاتُهَا. Okay, imagine she said, yes, I agree. Ibn Hazm would say marriage is invalid. Because literalist reading of the text, وَإِذْنُهَا صُمَاتُهَا, she has to remain silent. This literalist person, to this extent, wrote a book on al-akhlaq was-siyar, on ethics. And this happened with many other jurists. The question is, why did they write a separate book on ethics? The advocates of the no question, the no answer would say that because the fiqh as a discipline is a closed one. It has its own techniques of interpretation. It has its own concerns. It has its own methods. It has its own ways of reasoning. So you cannot go beyond this by adding the ethical aspects. It will disturb the whole system. So you have to go out it and write your own book when it comes to ethics in order to cover what you couldn't cover in it, which means that fiqh is not covering the ethics exclusively. There are some aspects that the fuqaha themselves could not incorporate into the corpus of fiqh, and they wrote separate works on it. The third approach, they reject the question itself. They say that this is a question related to the age of modernity and does not understand the historical context of the fiqh works. In modernity, we have a big question: is everything legal, ethical, or vice versa? Is it possible that I disobey the state, but still I am an ethically committed or morally committed person or not? So if I don't pay the taxes, or I don't know, and the people try to understand fiqh as the Islamic version of the law, and then they link to the ethics, but the whole stuff is wrong. Because the fiqh is not about the state law, the fiqh is about, I'm going to do please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to put his will into practice, and then sometimes I need professional help. So they reject the very question of it. The last discipline which contributed to ethics is adab. This is one of the disciplines, and which I did not cover yet in my in my course on Islamic ethics because it is a very elusive one and very difficult one. Adab as a term is almost untranslatable. We don't know how to translate. I personally have great difficulty with this. I have seen many researchers whose English is amazing, and they wrote the same thing. The adab is adab. It's just adab. And as a discipline, it's very difficult to delineate its borders, its scope, its concerns, its main questions, its approaches, its techniques, its tools. Very, very difficult. One of the most elusive terms and disciplines. If you want to put it simply, and to a certain extent simplistic even, so not really true, we can say that adab is an etiquette or manner instilled through education and commitment to a moral ideal. This is my own ijtihad in this. And as a discipline, again, I said it's elusive and vague to the extent that Ibn Khaldun described it as علم لا موضوع له. So it had no neatly defined scope or distinct subject. By going through the literature and the readings I could do, we can say that we have three possible scopes of adab as a discipline. The broadest one, and then two more narrow scopes. The broadest one is just a wide genre of non-specialist works which introduce general knowledge, something about almost everything to the general reader. So you will have a book which introduces knowledge in a way accessible to the general public with no specific topics. It speaks about almost everything with no in-depth knowledge about any of the items. Something like what we call now ثقافة العامة, general culture or something like this. This is one of the examples, نهاية الأرب في فنون الأدب by النويري from the 8th century Hijrah, the 13th century. You find this stuff. It's an encyclopedia of adab in the broadest sense of the meaning, and maybe 20 or 30 volumes. As I said, almost something about everything. You will find almost everything in it. The other two broad disciplines, one of them has very little relationship with ethics, the other much more. The scope of adab is the discipline which aims at mastering and perfecting the art of speaking and writing in Arabic. So it's about the language, how to master the language, speaking, writing. So it's adab like literature. Like al-udaba as we speak about them now. So this aim can be achieved by learning Arabic syntax, grammar, morphology, lexicography, rhetoric, in addition to studying exemplary pieces in poetry and prose. This is the least relevant scope of adab to ethics, because it's about grammar, it's about syntax, it's about writing styles, etc. But there are here and there some wise sayings, hikam, proverbs, amthal, stories and parables, qisas, loaded with moral content preserved in the Arab culture. So it can have some relevance, but as I said, the least relevance to the field of ethics. This is Mu'jam al-Udaba by al-Hamawi, which included the Udaba in this sense, those who are specialists in adab in this second scope or second understanding, as we mentioned. Al-Hamawi is from the 7th century Islamic Hijrah, the 13th century. The last one, the third scope of adab, which is the most relevant when it comes to ethics, is the discipline which has a distinctively moral, normative character, because it outlines the proper and ideal conduct that one should stick to, both as individual and, more importantly, as a member of a social or a professional network, like professional ethics, like bioethics that we spoke about yesterday. Some of the writings on adab in this sense, in the third sense, would include both content from inside and outside the Islamic tradition. How to behave as an ethically committed person or community or society or a profession. like the works of Ibn al-Muqaffa, Al-Adab al-Saghir and Al-Adab al-Kabir. You will find quotations from Indian traditions, from Persian traditions, from Greek traditions, and from Islam as well. And sometimes the moral content only from the Islamic tradition, like Ibn Abi Shaybah, Kitab al-Adab, and of course the famous Al-Adab al-Mufrad by Al-Bukhari. And also very relevant, as I said, professional ethics. You will have many titles in the Islamic tradition, Adab, and after it you will find a professional. Adab al-Qadi, the professional ethics of a judge. If you are a judge, how to behave and act like an ethically committed, morally committed judge. Adab al-alim wal-muta'allim, the ethics of the learner and the teacher. Adab al-Tabib, we spoke about it yesterday. The etiquettes of the physician. We had a book, the book of Ar-Ruhawi, about this. There is Adab al-Kahal, ophthalmologist, scribe, Adab al-Katib, a barber, Adab al-Hallaqin, all the professions that you can imagine about. We have literature speaking about adab, and then people related to this profession. By the way, also you have adab of Sufi circles. If you are a member of a certain Sufi circle, they have their own guidelines. Adab al-Shazili, for instance. If you are a member of the Shazili Sufi circle, how you should behave, what to wear, how to talk to people, etc. So this is also a very rich tradition of applied ethics, very applied in professional ethics. This is more or less mapping the field, how it works, the contribution of ethics, these different disciplines' contribution to the Islamic ethical tradition. What I want to conclude with, a couple of things related to the modern time now. This is all about the classical tradition, how the field has been mapped and structured in the Islamic tradition. One of the modern questions is the following: do we have a distinct disciplines called Islamic ethics? هل في فرع معرفي اسمه الأخلاق الإسلامية? A big debate. The people who wrote about Islamic ethics in the modern time, they always started their books with raising this question. Some people would say yes, others would say no, etc. I think by mapping the field now, it can explain this disagreement, because the field is an interdisciplinary one. So if you want to say that Islamic ethics existed like fiqh and theology and Sufism, etc., then it didn't. Because we didn't have, let's say, schools of Islamic ethics. We didn't have specialists in Islamic ethics the way we have the fuqaha Shafi'iyya and Malikiyya, etc., because it was interdisciplinary. The contribution is coming from different disciplines. But if you take it as an interdisciplinary field, something rooted in the Islamic tradition, then yes, we had it. How come all the huge amount of knowledge production throughout the centuries of Islamic history, and at the end you say that it didn't exist? One of the big questions also in the modern time, how to relate this rich tradition to the question of morality of today. So, okay, you have a very rich tradition in Islam. What would this tradition tell us now about the question of regulating our finance in the world? What would this mean? It's a big question. What would this mean in regulating our politics? Should we have a parliamentary system? Should we have a presidential system? What is ethical? What's unethical in this question? The issue of bioethics, we spoke about it yesterday. We'll continue also tomorrow. So there are very difficult questions of how to keep this tradition and to let it produce good answers, rigorous answers, well-argued answers for the modern questions that we have. This is one of the difficult questions. The modern questions raised in the age of modernity disturbed some of the old established dichotomies. even if you disagree with Ibn Taymiyya. The modern developments made it very difficult. Like, for instance, human intellect or aql and naql, human intellect and revelation. What are the sources of knowledge which will help us to judge and act as ethical or unethical? Is it human intellect? Is it revelation? Is it self-revealed knowledge, etc.? Nowadays, we have much more developments. Like, for instance, human intellect now is not accepted as a source of knowledge in an absolute way. We have now the scientific method. الأساليب العلمية. Human intellect must be controlled, must be based on hypotheses, controlled hypotheses. These hypotheses must be tested, and then we come to conclusions. Some hypotheses must be skipped out, others not, etc. So it's not just human intellect in the absolute sense of the word anymore. There are new developments which affected how people think about the good and the bad, like the significance of money in the modern time, our interest in having luxurious life. Political leaders would rise and fall, get elected and dismissed based on their success or failure in arranging economy of the country. So you can be the worst and the most corrupt person in the world, but as long as you run economy in a good way, you will be elected. And you will do fine. How to live with this now in the modern time? There is a very famous philosopher, moral philosopher at Harvard University. He wrote a very interesting book, a short book called What Money Cannot Buy. To have this title directly assumes that we think we can buy everything by money. And this wise person, philosopher, took his precious time to tell us it's not true. There are things that money cannot buy. This is normally a self-evident case that we should know that money cannot buy everything. Why would he write such a book? Because reality shows that we think differently. We think differently. People are chosen, are elected, they become leaders. Also, they have almost no ethics, no morality whatsoever. They lead the people in their societies, in their countries, because they let people live a luxurious life. So these are some of the questions that, of course, Islamic ethics in the modern time need to engage with. And the main or the $1 million question is that how to answer these questions, come up with discourse which is relevant to these questions without losing your link to the tradition. Because it's easy to remain in the tradition, in the history, to be a historian, just studying what people said in history, and you are completely isolated from what's going on. This is not very difficult. The other easy option is that you sever yourself from the history and just try to be practical and give direct answers without getting in depth of this. And these type of answers, severed from the tradition, are always superficial. I don't speak about Islam in particular. If you want to do good moral philosophy, secular moral philosophy, you cannot do this without having serious engagement with people like Kant, with people like Aristotle, like Plato, etc. You must have a tradition. Anyone who wants to provide well-argued answers must have a basis that he stands upon. And when it comes to the Islamic tradition, this is what we should do. So hopefully, inshallah, we will do some better and more work in this direction in the future. Thank you very much for listening.